In the run-up to the World Championship match starting on the 26th of November in Dubai, I'm looking through past games between Magnus Carlsen and Jan Nepomniachtchi, and I'm going to take just a little detour off that series. I want to look at a beautiful strategic game played between Maxime Vachier-Lagrave and Jan Nepomniachtchi, and it's best I kind of go through the game and you'll understand why I want to look at this. So this was played in the Sinquefield Cup in 2017, and we see Maxime playing e4 and Nepo goes into his favourite Najdorf variation. So bishop e2, e5, and now knight f3. Now we saw this in a video I showed in a blitz game between Carlsen and Nepo, and we are following that game exactly. So this game was played around about a month after that Carlsen-Nepo blitz game, and we're following the moves exactly. So basically it looks like both players have done their homework here. Nepo clearly came to this game with an improvement in mind. So here is where Carlsen played, if you remember, Castle's kingside and got a bit of a bind on the queenside, although it was far from clear, this game actually. But yeah, basically Carlsen succeeded in winning this game, but it was actually very messy objectively. But here, instead of castling, well, Maxime managed to get his improvement in first. He played a5, and it looks like a pretty normal move. You know, you get this one pawn that controls these two pawns. Typical strategic pawn push in these kind of Sicilian positions. And here, well, there's no knight controlling the b6 square, so this knight can happily hop in here, which reinforces white's control over d5. So let's see what happened. Rook b8, okay, it's preemptive of course. And now knight d7. It's possible to play the bishop to e6 first, that might be an improvement. But knight d7 played, and an exchange, and then bishop e6. But here, just bishop c4, notice how Maxime is delaying castling because he wants to gain control over that d5 square. And with the knight embedded on b6, then it looks like white is achieving that. It's possible to sack a pawn. I mean, this is a typical kind of Najdorf pawn sack, but I mean, it looks like white has control over that position. So Nepo plays here queen c7, hitting the bishop. Queen d3, protecting the bishop. Bishop d8. Well, do you remember that game I showed not too long ago? It was from a bishop b5 check, Sicilian, where Nepo also tried bishop d8 to try and get some control over these squares, but Carlsen managed to keep control. Well, let's see here. c3, queen c6, Maxime still not castling. Queen c6, so Nepo trying to fight against the control over b6 and d5. But bishop d5 forces the queen back. I mean, if bishop takes, then knight takes, and you get this wonderful good knight against bad bishop position. And that's happening anyway, because after queen e8, bishop takes bishop. Now, if black were able to play pawn takes, then controlling d5, that would be fantastic. But the problem is that just queen takes d6 and black's pawns are an absolute mess. Of course, white is a pawn up there, but it's more the fact that, you know, positionally it just stinks for black. Could play bishop takes b6 here, but well, the bishop will come back to one of these squares, and white still has fantastic control in the middle. I mean, it's a tough choice for black here, but Nepo played queen takes and then knight d5, and we have this typical good knight against bad bishop position. This is the dream position for white in the Najdorf, and it's the nightmare position for black. So, but Nepo is trying to get activity. f5, castles, rook c8, rook d1. Maxime just keeping control in the middle, very sound. Has control over e4, queen f5. Now, this is a really interesting moment. Just have a little think. How would you play here as white? You know, it's one of those positions where you know you have a big strategic advantage with white, that good knight against the bad bishop. But which pieces do you exchange? How do you want to play this one? Well, this is very interesting. I mean, you know, my instinct would be perhaps to take here, to simplify the position down. You know, you dream of a good knight against bad bishop endgame. But actually here it's not so clear, because the king could have the chance to move into e6 just to put a little bit of pressure on the knight on d5. And securing the pawn on d6, it's actually not so clear. Maxime just dropped the bishop, the queen back to e2, and it's a good decision. So guards the pawn on f2, obviously, but that queen can be very useful later on. Let's see. c4, so securing the knight on d5, and well, that's another reason why the queen dropped back to e2 to hold that pawn. Bishop h4, so Nepo trying to sort of create a little weakness here, but actually, I mean, this certainly doesn't harm white's position. Rook a3, excellent move. So the rook shows that it controls some squares, perhaps wants to move into the middle of the board. h4, yeah, doesn't hurt white's position playing like that. And now b4. Defends the pawn on a5, and that means the rook can move into the middle of the board and, you know, perhaps get some pressure here. Queen g6, h5, yeah, the squeeze continues all over the board. I mean, white has lots of lovely options here. Rook e3 to e4 is quite nice, that's a nice blockade, but knight e3 hits the queen, hits the pawn, so queen e6. Rook d3, I mean, this feels very logical. It's nice to connect the rooks, attacking the pawn, so bishop e7, and the knight comes back into d5, and the bishop therefore has to move out of range again. And this is a really nice move. There's a famous game played between Karpov and Dolmatov, played in 1980. It was actually from a Sveshnikov variation. And there, Karpov carried out a very similar maneuver with similar pieces on the board. He played rook f3. And the idea is just to exchange a pair of rooks, and that just takes pressure off, or potential pressure off f2, and makes it easier for white to carry out more strategic maneuvers, basically. So exchange of rooks, king g8. King g2, all very tidy. That's why actually, you know, Nepo inducing g3, well, he didn't need to do that. I mean, it's tough for black in this position because black is almost completely passive. But, you know, this is a very nice setup for the king on a light square, protected by the queen. And this one is about to appear, queen e4 with a big blockade. e4. From Nepo. And this is interesting, you know, you could just sit tight there with black and try to hold on. It's really unpleasant. But Nepo, you know, he likes activity, but this actually rather damages black's position. Knight e3, and this is the point that now that rook comes to a really nice square d5, and then the knight comes into f5. And that little rearrangement of pieces you can see with the pawn on e4, that the rook protects the knight, and now d6 is in massive trouble. And just for a moment, black's pieces are actually very awkwardly placed. Black's king really not in a good situation. It was actually very nice advancing this pawn, which actually rather cramps black's king position. And watch how Maxime exploits this. I mean, he has a very sensitive antennae for tactics, and here he spots a nice way to break through. c5, so that has to be taken, and now queen c4, and this is very uncomfortable for the king. So if, let's say, king h8, then rook takes c5, and you can see that back rank is pretty weak. This is not a nice position for black at all, and the queen is on a beautiful position looking at these points. So queen f7, so that just blocks the diagonal, but rook c5, and it's the same, black has the same difficulty. You know, the rook potentially comes to c8, maybe c7. This pawn is weak. h6, and yeah, the king is in trouble here. And another nice move from MVL, g4, just securing the knight and the pawn. So you can see the king is just in real trouble there, really cramped. And now the threat is to play rook c7 and to get to the g7 pawn. I mean, black can try various things, but it's all in vain. Rook e7 played. Okay, watch out. Exchange of queens. Here. Yeah, you don't want to take because queen f3 check. But queen d4. It's interesting that MVL, you know, keeps the queens on here. You know, I'm sure that endgame is tremendous for white, but you know, he senses that the king is in massive trouble here, and this is the easiest way to crack black's position. Queen d5. I mean, black has virtually no moves in this position. Yeah, if the rook goes back, then, for example, queen d8, and that's the end of the show for the king. So g6, and, well, there really is nothing for black to do, but obviously that opens up the king. Rook f8 played. Nice move, just simplifying down. And queen e6, that was the final move of the game. Here, Nepo resigned. Let's just see why. Well, if the king, let's say the king goes back here, then queen takes pawn. So white is now a pawn up, and a discovered check threatened, plus queen takes b7. Black has nothing. And crucially, the king is absolutely secure. Somehow, you know, a very fitting final position that the queen dominates, and MVL avoided the queen exchange, and you know, his judgment was absolutely correct. And also, the other piece that remains on the board is the good knight and the bad bishop. So I wanted to show this game because I think it shows a certain stubborn streak from Nepo. You know, he wanted to play his knight off again, but once again lost, you know, strategically when his opponent, in this case Vachier-Lagrave, dominated those squares on b6 and d5, and we saw Carlsen do the same just a month before that, basically. So Nepo has to be careful. I'm sure we're going to see a broader palette of openings from Nepo in the World Championship match, but I'm just noting it. He has a certain stubborn streak and likes certain kinds of positions. So will he have broadened his tastes out by the time it comes to November? We shall see. Thanks for watching.